Welcome to the Space Fund webinar. The moon is open for business on this 51st anniversary of the Apollo moon landing. We're very pleased to welcome our special guests, Sean Mahoney and Niki Werkheiser. We're going to start the webinar with a brief overview of the current commercial landscape for moon activities. Then Rick is going to interview Sean and Niki, and we'll take a few questions from you at the end. So go ahead and use that chat function in the Zoom meeting room in order to submit your questions. And you can submit questions anytime throughout the presentation, and we'll get to those questions from you guys at the end. Just a brief disclaimer to make the lawyers happy. This presentation represents neither an offer to sell or a solicitation of any, excuse me, neither an offer to sell nor a solicitation of an offer to purchase any securities. Any such offer or solicitation shall be only to qualified purchasers as defined in the Investment Company Act of 1940 as amended. The terms summarized herein are confidential and constitute proprietary information and trade secrets of SpaceFund, Inc. In addition, these materials are provided for convenience only and may not be relied upon. SpaceFund, our vision is to open the space frontier to everyone, to enable everyone to help open the frontier, and to let anyone who shares in the risk share in the profits. So today I'm just going to briefly walk through a little overview of the commercial lunar ecosystem. Right now, we're currently, we've cataloged 84 different private companies that are initiating or currently undergoing moon projects right now. When we look at those companies based on the SpaceFund sectors of interest, you can see that the majority of these companies are within the transportation realm, with several of the, with a large number of them also in the supply chain sector. So let's go through that in a little bit more detail. When we look at not just the companies, but the projects that those companies are undertaking, we can see that there are 54 different projects right now within the realm of transportation. So this is everything from launch to in-space transportation, all the way through to lunar landers and rovers. When we look at the beyond Earth orbit communications sector, we have 10 companies working on communications platforms to get information to and from the moon. And then we have 19 companies that are working in the life support or what we call human factor sector. And this is everything from life support to habitats. And we have them broken down here into surface habitats and in-space habitats, companies working on both. In relation to the moon, of course, in-space habitats might mean the lunar gateway or other habitats near the moon, even if they're not on the surface. And then we have 35 projects in the supply chain sector. So this is everything from in-space resource utilization all the way through manufacturing and production and distribution and storage of in-space resources. And then the final sector here, which is energy, we have 12 companies working on different energy projects to help us make sure that we have plenty of electricity when we're on the moon. You can find more information about all of these companies and projects on the SpaceFund website. spacefund.com/moon will take you straight to our moon database that details who these companies are and the projects that they're working on. So just a little bit of background on NASA and what NASA is up to right now. NASA has been working recently to commercialize low Earth orbit. And this is really fantastic. We now have commercial cargo, commercial crew, and we are in process of putting together commercial space stations. Namely, one of SpaceFund's portfolio companies, Axiom, is working very closely with NASA to make commercial space stations a reality. So after this big push for the commercialization of low Earth orbit, as NASA is moving further and further out into the solar system, most of you may be familiar with the Artemis program, which is NASA's return to the moon. So the stated goal of the Artemis program is to land the first woman and the next man on the moon by 2024. The other stated goal is that this time we will be establishing a permanent presence on the moon. And while NASA's stated goal is to go to the moon to prepare for Mars, we are really excited to see that they're leveraging taxpayer investments to seed what may become a commercial Earth, Moon, or cis-lunar economy along the way. And NASA is relying very heavily and having a big push towards both international and commercial partners for the Artemis program. And specifically, when we look at those commercial partners, I'd like to highlight the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program, or the CLPS program, which has already made 4 awards to 3 different commercial companies. And this is really a change from the way that NASA has done things in the past. Instead of owning and determining all of the specifics of a project or a piece of equipment, instead NASA is simply buying services from these commercial customers now. So a very different way of doing business that's very innovative and very supportive of the commercial ecosystem. So just a quick overview of who we are here at SpaceFund. We really did help start the new space revolution. We're still making it happen. We know who is doing what, how, and where. We currently have 2 funds, 2 different ways to invest. We've brought together some of the world's leading experts in the space industry with a world-class financial team, and have positioned ourselves in the middle of the space industry's deal flow to capture the biggest investment opportunity of this generation. We do have an unparalleled deal flow pipeline. We're currently tracking over 2,000 space startups around the world, have published reality ratings on over 400 companies, reviewed over 125 active deals in the last few months. And actually this slide should be updated. It says we've invested in 3, but we've in fact made 5 investments now. We also had our first exit. Masten Space recently exited. We're also invested in Axiom, Orbit Fab, a closed loop aquaponics system company called Eden Grow Systems, and a stealth space company that we hope to be able to announce in the coming months as they come out of stealth. One of the things that I always like to point out is that we have our reality rating databases available on our website for free for anybody to review, download, and play with that information. We continue to release new reality rating databases fairly frequently, so check back often for new information. And we also have 2 special databases. One is our exits database that tracks all of the new space startup exits. And the second database, the one that I mentioned just a moment ago, the Moon List, catalogs all of the companies who are working on Moon projects. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Rick Tumlinson and to do the interview with Niki and Sean. We'll let each of them introduce themselves. But Rick, I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, brilliant. If we were on the moon, that wouldn't be so. First of all, I want to congratulate my friends over in UAE for their launch. My friend Dr. Ababi and Talal and Kaisi and the rest of the UAE team are really doing something exciting there. And really, really, really hope they nail the landing. So our first guest is Niki Werkheiser, and Niki is the lead of the NASA Lunar Surface Innovation Initiative, which is a part of STMD. And Niki, I'm going to let you explain the STMD purview and what it is you're going to be working on, and then we'll jump into some questions here in a minute. Go ahead. Can't hear you, Niki.
Niki, you'll have to take yourself off mute.
Uh-oh. Can't hear you, Niki.
There we go. Now can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, it was giving me a message that the host wouldn't let me unmute, and then I had 2 mutes. I apologize for that. The fun of teleworking, yes. So the Space Technology Mission Directorate, we have what I consider to be the very exciting job of really developing what I consider to be the core technologies and capabilities that we need across NASA's missions, all the way from our early TRL all the way up through technology demonstration missions. And to really get to the crux of it, the idea is that STMD will develop the technologies and the demonstrations that we really need that allows us to retire the core technology hurdles and the risks. And then our customers, which we consider to be other NASA mission directorates like Human Exploration and Operations and Science Mission Directorate, as well as industry and our international partners, they can then take those technologies, retire the core risks, and focus on scaling those up to enable full mission capabilities. So today I'll talk some about the Lunar Surface Innovation Initiative. And in addition to that, I'm also the program executive for our game-changing development program, which focuses on that tech maturation of the mid-TRL, which is my favorite, and as many people refer to it, kind of that valley of death in terms of technology maturation, when we're really focused on transitioning from the early low TRL, which is more, I would say, university and R&D focused, and then into the higher TRL, which is obviously more focused on industry and commercial infusion. Yeah, thanks.
Great. I mean, if you want to go ahead, yeah, why don't you talk a little bit about this stuff, and then I'll introduce Sean. He can talk a little bit about the company, and then we'll jump into this free-form Q&A that we've got for you. Why don't you
okay, yeah, and I don't, sure, I'll be happy to. I won't skip to too much of the punchline on the consortium. I'll talk, go ahead and set up kind of what that is, and then I think when we have some of our Q&A, I want to make sure to leave time there for open dialogue about this, as this is a really, really important one to us. So the Lunar Surface Innovation Initiative was established shortly after Artemis was announced in 2019. And the idea is really to create the kind of what we consider to be the 6 capability development areas that I consider to be basic infrastructure on the moon. The 6 areas include ISRU, many of the areas that y'all mentioned earlier actually, extreme environments, extreme access, manufacturing and excavation and construction, as well as surface power and dust mitigation. So the consortium was a key tenet from day one of the LSI initiative. The whole idea here and where this is different than previous programs possibly, and we'll probably get into that a little bit, is more that from day one we want to establish true public-private partnerships and collaborations with industry and universities and nonprofits, as well as other government organizations. But in order to do that, we don't want to just do the standard get together and have a consortium meeting. It's kind of a kumbaya, we're all excited, right? And then we go back to our day jobs. So part of the consortium is we've actually established not only the 2 large biannual meetings, but we have the focus groups across each of those 6 capability areas, which we meet on once a month. And these are really meant to be more consistent and formal dialogues that we can have with all of the stakeholders together. And quite frankly, where NASA listens, we share what we think the key gaps and the key objectives are for developing these technologies to establish this infrastructure. And then we want to understand kind of for these areas where that real value proposition is for our external stakeholders. And so in that way, instead of having, we have great industry days and those sorts of things, but when we have those, a lot of times we already have written the solicitations. We've already kind of defined what we put on the streets. And the idea here is to really get ahead of that and have this ongoing dialogue so that we can better target the true value proposition for the types of public and private partnerships we're looking for. So I'll talk about that more when we get into, hopefully, I love to discuss it more from a Q&A and open dialogue perspective, but that's the general concept.
Great, great. And Sean is the CEO of Masten Space Systems, who are actually old timers now. They're like new space old timers. So one of these companies that stayed alive long enough to actually begin to succeed thanks to their partnership with NASA. Sean, tell us about what you're doing. Audio, Meagan? Hang on.
There we go. Okay.
Sure.
I have to ask permission to be able to. Anyway, thanks, Rick, Meagan, really appreciate it. For those, before I even get into the punchline or get into the details of the company, the punchline is whether you're investor or you're someone who wants to operate, we have hit that inflection point and the game is changing. And so the time to act is now, for whatever that act means. So we'll talk more about that, but that's going to be the punchline I think I'm going to come back to throughout the rest of this discussion is, if you want to be part of this, get in the arena. This is not the time to sit on the couch and wait and see. Get in it. So I have the pleasure to serve as the CEO for Masten Space Systems. We have been working on lunar lander technology for a decade and a half now. We first kind of rose to attention and prominence in the industry from the competition for the NASA Centennial Lunar Lander Challenge, sponsored by Northrop Grumman, presented by X Prize. I think that checks the boxes. And as is often the case, you win an X Prize, and then the next thing you do is wait 10 years until there's an actual market for the derived technology. What we've done through that period of time, though, is focus on how Masten can keep developing the business, not just the technology, but the business, which is, step one, don't be dead. And step two, if you find yourself violating step one, fix it quickly. Where does that leave us today? We've taken that core technology that was used for the Lunar Lander Challenge and has been used for the terrestrial testbed work to help others who were developing technology, and are applying that to Masten Mission 1. You'll note that I don't say Masten CLPS mission. This is Masten Mission 1 that includes the CLPS payloads. That's the way that NASA has set this up, and we are following along. In December of 22, we're headed to the South Pole with 8 NASA instruments and other payloads that will be going. Yep, we have space available. And we'll talk more about this if there's interest, but what's kind of interesting is mass is not really the limiting factor at this point. For this Masten Mission 1, everyone wants the front row seat or a window seat. So bottom surface is actually something that is of major interest. This render of the lander, and I hate showing renders because anyone can generate a render, but this gives you an idea of what this vehicle is going to look like when we head to the South Pole here in a couple of years. The next slide just kind of gives you some idea of a little bit of what else we've been doing. We've been flying a lot. We have over 600 vehicle operations that we have been doing. And why does that matter? Because you really want to know that you have ironed at least some of the kinks out before you try to land on the moon. It is much easier to service this vehicle in Mojave than it will be to service it on the moon. And so that picture right there, if folks aren't familiar with some of the things that we've done, that actually is the same airframe that was used to compete for the first preliminary phase in the Lunar Lander Challenge, upgraded and modified over time, and it's actually doing a landing burn. That's not firing, that's not going away, that's coming down. And as often said, going up is easy, coming down is even easier. Sticking that landing is the hard part. And Rick, you might need to have Meagan unmute you as well. Or I can start asking you questions.
Here we go. Okay, there we are. Good stuff. And look, there are a lot of moving parts to what's about to happen here, we hope. I guess, the biggest question, we're 1 year beyond the 50th, 51st, and we're going back to the moon. So I'm going to start with you, Niki, and ask you, what do you think is different this time that's going to produce a different outcome as we head back to the moon this time?
Yeah, so great question. And I think there are several differences this time. As Meagan noted, this time the biggest difference is we're going to the moon to stay, which really excites me to no end. This really means that we have to establish that infrastructure that I mentioned previously. It's absolutely necessary that we do that. So while NASA and industry did work together, of course, in Apollo, and we all know the story and how successful that was, and that's part of NASA's genetic makeup, we are doing and approaching that differently this time, in terms with Artemis and in terms of how we partner. So the CLIPS model that Meagan referenced is very similar to what we've been doing in LEO, right, with Space Station, where we're buying a service. And I think that is a great example because I think, if I remember correctly, I believe there are 14 CLIPS providers right now approved, which tells me, we have a healthy ecosystem. I find that very encouraging. I sincerely believe that the only way that we can and should return to the moon, and especially if we're looking at a sustainable stay, is that we have to do that in full collaboration and in partnership between NASA, industry, and our international partners. I mean, to be quite candid, I think that's the only way that we can achieve this. Even though we've been to the moon before, it's very different, as we all know, to go to stay and to have sustainable living and operations and to have the technologies that we need to do that for long term. So I think we have to work hand in hand and leverage those mutual strengths, and having public-private partnerships and different novel approaches to how we partner, where we all kind of have skin in the game and we're willing to, from a NASA and government perspective, take more risk, I think is very important. The last thing I'll say about that is I really believe that it's the government's job to invest in things that aren't profitable for industry in order to really enable the things that are. That's why I think that the LSII is so important, because it means that NASA can really help establish that basic infrastructure that I'll say is kind of the precursor to getting to the sustainable capabilities that we need. So I think it's a very exciting time to do so. I'll tell you, I actually told my mom the other day, I dreamt of working for NASA since I was tiny. And I told her, I said, I never thought I would get so excited about procurement mechanisms. But it is 100% the truth, because it's all about being able to get to each other and work together truly as a vested stakeholder community. And I think it's different this time in the way that NASA is trying to really lay that path to do that.
Yeah, so you kind of answered my next question in there, and we'll stay with you just for a second and go over to Sean, and that is that, the title of what we're doing here is The Moon is Open for Business, and you're kind of hinting at that this time probably the biggest difference is this interrelationship, this partnership, maybe even NASA seeing its role as catalyzing the development of business on the moon. Is that how you see it, Niki?
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that is an inherent, aspect and job of the government, is to do exactly that. Yeah, and that means also NASA being willing to take more risk, and like we talked about with the CLIPS, and like we've done on Space Station, buying these services that we can all utilize.
Great, Sean. What does that title of ours mean to you? You're a thoughtful guy.
The biggest thing about the moon being open for business is that we have moved definitively from just talking about it to execution. And with all proper respect for every other initiative, prize, whatever else that has come before, there is money being spent for private companies to deliver stuff to the moon. I can pretty much, if we stopped there and said, okay, that's it, that is a huge inflection point between no money, just talk, and okay, now we're doing it. Or there's risk, sure, but it is actually happening. Mm-hmm. And NASA is taking a bit of a portfolio approach in this. They've got 4 missions on the books now. If they have a 25% success rate, first of all, 3 of the 4 are going to be trying to figure out what the heck happened. But you will have a successful demonstration. And once you have that, that removes a tremendous amount of uncertainty from any business venture that's going to be thinking about how to work and operate in cis-lunar space. And the impact of this is actually already being seen. There's a number of people who are forward-leaning in lunar who have been pushing the envelope for years. Not everyone necessarily signed up to participate in a program or something that when this was announced. But boy, they're coming out of the woodwork now. So to me, saying it's open to business is to say there is actually a business. And look, I love the X Prize. I have, the company is alive because of the X Prize. I have the pleasure of serving in my role because of that X Prize. I could not ever make the business plan close for the Google Lunar X Prize. I could never make the numbers work. I can make the numbers work now.
Okay, so speaking of the numbers and Niki's mention of her joy of procurement, which is one of the more interesting statements I've heard.
Trust me, I never thought I'd say it either. Yeah.
Sean, given that that interface basically takes place in terms of procurements, and I'm not assuming, but I'm wondering. Let me ask you this way: what is your biggest challenge as a private sector company when you're? And I know I think you're in a slightly different category than what Niki works on. You guys are not necessarily linear up and down the tree.
No, right. We definitely overlap in several areas.
You don't have to get too upset about her getting mad and deciding not to cut your next check. But I'd like to know, what is your biggest challenge working with the government as a private sector company?
Having, just as a broad answer to that question, the problem is timing. It's all about timing. The timing of a small company that is living week to week, month to month, is not the same thing as the timing for government in general, much less space development projects. And so that has been the biggest challenge. To provide a service in partnership with the government is phenomenal, but there have been several times, and I said step one is don't be dead. We've hit some of those points where our partner had a delay. And they said, okay, yeah, we'll pick this up in 3 months or 6 months, or I don't have the ability to, like, I have to be continually creating value, and it's really difficult to do that, especially, and so for any entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs, don't price everything at your aspirational future price, because when that future arrives, is not something that's into your control. So, well,
we're going to come back. We'll come back around to that one in just a minute.
But the timing, I mean, space has a very small end. There's a small number of programs. There's only a few opportunities. And if you're trying to run quickly and break things, it can be really difficult to match the cadence of when things are happening from the folks on the government side. And it's not that they don't know this. You got to understand it. You got to work with it. So.
Yeah, having started a couple of things myself, the idea of the runway is the absolute nightmare for all founders and CEOs. How do you pave the runway while you're trying to take off? And I think perhaps that might be one of the bigger challenges, the idea of government time spans as programs get developed and things, and you're burning investor money during that time. Niki, I'm really curious, to be able to establish permanence on the moon, obviously one of the big things. is ISRU. And I know that there's part of that that comes under your purview. And what do you see? You know, first of all, what is the macro plan that NASA is looking at? And what do you see coming out of the tech development side that you're working on in terms of, by the way, for those who don't know what in situ resource utilization is what ISRU means. And it's basically living off the land, using the resources where you are to do whatever it is you're going to do there. And over to you, Nikki. I figured I might want to explain that. So.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, we speak in acronyms, and we'd have a lot longer meetings if we didn't, right? So yes, and this is an area that we have been working hard. I think part of the battle was starting out with this in terms of the Artemis objectives, was that we have some brilliant folks, internal and external to NASA and ISRU area, that have been looking at this for a long time, right? We've all heard this, we've all seen it in the movies. It's been you know, a common part of every mission we've planned for Mars and Moon. But we didn't necessarily have a unified, well, I'll just say roadmap or strategy on how we were going to get there and how we're going to develop these technologies. And the exciting part of this is it has huge potential for industry teaming and university teaming, and it has to be part of, you know, inherently it has to be part of sustainable missions. So the first thing we did is really sit down with an agency. We had some internal studies and did a lot of technology searches to make sure that we understood really where the state of the art was, not only in the space business, but quite frankly, you know, terrestrially as well. There's a lot that we can leverage and utilize here, and came up with a real strategy on how we're going to get the technology where we need it to be to scale these systems up, like I talked about earlier. So now we have what I'll call a leader-follower path defined for our ISRU strategy, with our ice mining technologies and capabilities as what I'll say is the leader. We have some early CLIPS demonstrations. I think one of those actually will be flying on the Masten mission that's on the books, and focusing on ice mining capabilities. And with our follower being oxygen, O2 from regolith extraction on the Moon. And there's a lot of capability there. And then in parallel to us planning the early flight demos for the ice mining, we're also in parallel for that follower path doing the high fidelity ground demonstration right here on Earth using our higher fidelity regolith simulants and thermal vac chambers, for example. And so we have SBIRs, we have broad agency announcement agreements and contracts. We have a multitude of efforts underway with industry and with universities studying and working on the materials, the processes, and the technologies for those capabilities. The results of those early flight and this high fidelity ground demonstration, the outcomes of those will help to inform 2 to 3 subsystem demonstrations. We'll be flying on the CLIPS missions in the 24 to 26-ish time frame, which will then in turn inform what we call our ISRU pilot, scaled pilot system, which would be just what it says, an integrated pilot system for ISRU that would be capable of consumables production at a scaled rate, which is where a lot of our discussion is. When we look at enabling full missions, we're looking at metric tons. And so in this case, we might be looking at hundreds of kilograms. But to retire that core risk I talked about earlier, you really need to test this system out using the pilot and then be able to scale it up to enable full missions. So that's our ISRU path, and it's one that we are heavily, I won't even say collaborating with, but heavily reliant on working with our industry partners as well as our international partners to meet that roadmap.
Got it. Yep, because you don't want to be bringing all that stuff from Earth, that's for sure. So
right.
Over to you. Well, no, actually one more for you, Nikki. I'm really curious. There's, as this begins to happen and we look at, let's say, establishing a lunar or Earth-lunar economy, we're going to want to bring in lots of new players, perhaps some that are maybe a little out of the normal box. Are there any sort of conversations going on between NASA? Now, I know the commercial companies have their own roadmaps in terms of who they speak to, and that may be unusual in terms of space. But for NASA itself, are y'all talking to any companies you wouldn't normally think of as being players in space?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, I don't know if at some point here we're going to probably throw up what I call the money chart that shows all the different mechanisms that we are using, again, those different types of procurement mechanisms to not only reach out to our traditional new space and old space, I hate those terms sometimes, but also our non-traditional space, right? So we really use kind of a suite of tools in the toolbox that we're trying to do that through. I mentioned earlier the consortium and how we're not only having the two large consortium meetings that are more kind of your traditional consortium meetings, but the smaller focus groups. With the consortium, we have specifically made sure to target and to reach out. I should say that Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Labs is leading that effort for us as the LSI system integrator. And as a UARC, they're really going and reaching out to not only the folks that we work with a lot, but non-traditional. So for example, at our kickoff in late February, we did a survey, and I think 52% of the participants had never worked with STMD or really knew what we were doing, which we were very happy about. You know, we even are using tools like crowdsourcing. So this chart kind of shows the different kind of battle rhythm of different solicitations and ways that we get out and work with industry and universities and nonprofits. This does not include our international partner collaboration at all. This is specifically for U.S. companies and universities. This is an every year battle rhythm kind of thing. So we do centennial challenges, for example, that we did. Many of you might have heard of the 3D printed habitat challenge. And then had several new companies that were not familiar with what NASA was doing before that have spawned from that. I'm a big fan of crowdsourcing. I'm a huge convert. Had heard about it, you know, about a decade ago and thought, well, that's kind of cool. Now I use it regularly in my toolbox, and I have been consistently amazed with the results that we get and how we find things that no matter how many conferences, space conferences we go to and talk to folks, we find things that we didn't know were out there and new ways of looking at things. Any agency NASA size is going to have groupthink, there's no, it's silly to say that we wouldn't. And so I think the way you combat that is that to make sure that you do have these type of outlets that we can tap into the non-traditional space. And I think it's just as important as well for you know, our larger old space industry to also work with our new space, mentor, collaborate. And then the same thing with the non-traditional space folks coming in, that we welcome them with open arms and we have these open dialogues as part of these focus groups and really bring them into the fold and not just, you know, talk NASA acronyms for hours on end, but really talk about getting to the heart or what are the capabilities that we all need and how are those internal investments and interests that our external stakeholders are making applicable to that to get us all there quicker. Yeah.
Great, great. And first of all, Niki, I do want to point out as one of the guys who coined the term new space, the counter to that isn't old space. I never use the term. I always call it traditional. You know,
I like that. Yeah.
Old, they're just traditional. And then now I guess we're looking at what we might want to call next space, or once it really gets going and everybody's successful, it'll just be space. But in the meantime, kind of looking forward here now, we've got these companies like Sean's and the other players that are out there. Before I go any further on that, I want to ask one thing about that chart. So basically what you're saying with that chart is every year there is 600 million being made available in all of these different categories, or some of those switch on and switch off as we move forward?
So every year we have these solicitations and opportunities that go out, I'll say. It doesn't mean that we award the full 600 million in that execution year, but say it's a 2 or 3 year contract, like many of our tipping points. Okay. Yeah, the full contract value is 600 million worth. Yeah, and we're increasing that greatly every year. Yeah.
There's a significant amount of money coming out of NASA for all of this initiative.
Right.
That leads me into my next question, because everything that you're doing now, that Sean's doing now, all of us are interested in doing, is going to require this next generation of companies, entrepreneurs, startups, maybe somebody who's listening to this this event today and getting inspired to go out and do something. And using your own crystal balls, I would like to ask Sean, looking at your crystal ball, what do you think is a viable entity that somebody might want to start working on right now? what are the gaps? You know, if we have maps and there's gaps in those maps, let's say, of the ecosystem that's about to be created. Where would you, if you were starting right now, go in, you know, and start a company up, start something up? What would you do?
I would not get into the launch business. I would not get into the lunar delivery transportation business. I think 14 companies are already identified there. So I would say that space is a little bit tight. Part of what I do, part of our business model, is to pay attention and figure out what are those things that are coming up next. So I don't know if I can tell you the exact service, but I can tell you the approach. The approach where I would be, and maybe we say we are investing our money, is taking the disruption that you have seen in launch, and now you're seeing it in transportation to the surface, and carrying that on. Break the model of the development cycle. If you can imagine for a second that launch prices dropped, but you didn't have small sat revolution, you wouldn't have had the benefits that come from. So from a LEO perspective, small sat, CubeSat, all of that stuff that was inferior to the standard of the day, but offered a different advantage. That's the sort of thing, that's where I think the value is going to come. It's going to come from people who are able to value engineer. If you're a fan of Apple, this is not iPhone time, this is Mac time. This is take a look, see what people are doing, and find a way to do it cheaper. And to deliver most of that functionality or a chunk of that functionality for a substantially different price. And the cadence of testing, the availability of tools, all of these things add up to the point that that's where I think that opportunity is. And if I may, the other thing that I'm going to cram into my crystal ball, if you're not familiar with NASA, there's a lot of different parts and pieces. And so Niki's money chart, the CLIPS program and the Artemis program are not directly part of that. There's other parts, but STMD, Space Technology Mission Directorate, is essential to innovation in this industry. Right. And we've benefited from it. Other companies have benefited from it. If you are, if you're inclined to be interested in innovation, that's the space that needs vocal support, and that, not just a place to go and find support and like-minded folks, but also the sort of place. Humans and science are phenomenal. There's a lot of folks that argue for those, but making sure you're articulating the value to members of Congress and things like that about the value that STMD brings is really important. So in my crystal ball, making sure STMD continues to have funding, even if the delivery to the moon isn't in that bucket, that's where the seed corn is.
Great. Look, we're going to jump into the questions from the audience, and Meagan is going to manage that, and we'll come back over. You have one for Niki, Meagan, that we can head over.
Sure. Let's start with one for Niki. Sorry, I'm scrolling through here. Goodness. Okay, a few weeks ago, Bridenstine posted on Twitter about establishing a cost per ton delivered to the moon for the Artemis moon base. What would be a policy procurement goal of that program?
So let me make sure I understand the question. So Can you repeat it? I want to make sure I understand because we have a lot of different.
Yes. Yeah. So a few weeks ago.
So I want to make sure I know what's. Yeah.
So a few weeks ago, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine posted on Twitter about establishing a cost per ton delivered to the moon.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of, I think the question is, how would that work from a procurement perspective?
Right. So there's a lot going on there, right? Obviously, and that's key if we're going to have a sustainable presence on the moon, that we can get there and we can get the things that we need there. I think some of that does start with CLIPS. I think we're going to learn a lot through the early CLIPS missions and buy down a lot of our risk and do a lot of our technology demonstrations and science, as we mentioned. Of course, we have the HLS, the Human Landing Systems, that are led out of our Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate. And here recently, you know, they down selected 3 contractors who are doing studies right now on that, and we're making those selections. So the way that we're approaching it is more of a services-based model, and handling our procurement just like we talked about earlier. It's not as much as the way we did it in the Apollo days, where yes, we're working with industry, but it was the more traditional contractual mechanisms with the contractors as subs to NASA and delivering to NASA and it being a quote-unquote NASA vehicle. These are going to be services that we use. And so doing the sorts of studies that we're doing now, looking at the different ways that you could skin the cat and the different designs and things like cryo, for example, how we're going to use cryogenic fluid management as part of these different studies and systems helps us. And we're doing this all through our broad agency announcements, which are those public-private partnerships. So each of those companies is putting skin in the game, right? That's how this works. And so it's a very different model procurement-wise. And so approaching it where we look at multiple companies and do it through these public-private partnerships, I think allows us to get there quicker, and we iterate quicker than we do in our more traditional acquisition models that we've used in the past. It also helps to get price down. It's a very competitive market, and we're truly doing it as joint partners to get there.
Great, thank you, Niki. Now here's one for Sean. As you noted, Sean, the most important thing for startups in this game is simply to survive, which is not an easy task. So the question is, with a fully realized system, what do you expect your annual launch cadence to be? And is this model Artemis independent? Which is to say, can this work without Artemis?
Yeah, thanks, Meagan, and whoever asked the question. The launch cadence, I don't control. It's a question of the customer. And so the system is designed such that we can fly it as much. You'd probably push me if I said, oh yeah, we're gonna be flying 4 times a year. I'm not anticipating in the immediate term a launch rate that is that high. But it is Artemis independent because it has to be. Just like we're launch vehicle agnostic because it has to be. And so the approach that we have has been to leverage the technology development that has already gone into the system over a decade, and then craft, it's still a baseline, and then we can customize to apply it to particular things. But the unfortunate part is the uncertainty around the market is big enough. I don't know when it is, but whenever it is, we're going to be ready to go. And the related part to that is what is the lunar delivery going to look like in 10 years? When we're at 61 years since the first human landing, what is that going to look like? And there's a whole bunch of different possibilities. It would be unwise, I think, to put all of your eggs in a single basket unless you have the ability to make the market do that. Instead, what we have done is we've said we're going to have capabilities that will be applicable to large base kind of structure or a lot of small things. We've got the path, the technology path, and the market path we have intentionally been working on so that we'll be able to be applicable to whichever one comes up.
And Meagan, if I may, I don't mean to step on Sean's question,
Yeah.
but going back to your earlier point about STMB and thank you for saying that, but I really am a believer in it, not just because I work there. I just want to say too, that those that are looking at working with NASA, you know, this core technology development takes time. And so even if you see a company like Masten and, you know, it's between launches, we're not flying quite yet, there is a lot of work that has to happen behind the scenes, and a lot of, you know, I mentioned cryo and ISRU, all of these areas. And so STMD, that battle rhythm I was talking about of announcement opportunities, we have things called tipping points, for example, that we put out that are, you know, multi-million-dollar awards across all those different capability areas and more, propulsion, manufacturing, construction, that are being awarded all along the way. Yes, they are.
Doing 4 hours and 7 minutes, not that I'm keeping track.
Yeah. So I just want folks out there to know that it's not just, you're not only having contracts to fly in the actual launches, there's a lot of other types of efforts and development announcements and opportunities that are consistently out there. And that's why we wanted to put that together for STMD, so you could see it all in one place, because it can be quite overwhelming when you go on NASA's website and they're all kind of parsed out and you don't know when to be watching for it, especially if you don't live and breathe this, you know, as more of the traditional space. So we're trying to make that easier, an easier entry point for that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, Nikki, that is so important. So if, to the investors that might be on this, this discussion, there was an investor who said, yeah, we're not interested in any business that is taking money from the government. And I said, that is absurd, especially in this industry. And it's fine. You know what? You can have whatever investment portfolio or approach, but understanding how to work with the system is really important. And I hate the fact that it is such a high wall to climb to understand some of this stuff. And NASA is bending over backwards trying to find ways to engage, and the virtuous companies are doing the same right back, right? Like, don't complain about a thing, use it, and then be part of changing the process on the next round. And so that, for an investor, that would be the thing that I'd be looking for. Are you talking to someone who understands the way the world works now? Because if you got a better mousetrap, but you don't understand, you know, if you've never heard of Niki and you're saying you're going to do something on the lunar surface, you're not plugged in to where the real world is today. Not that you have to be drinking buddies with Niki, but you got to know that LSII exists. You've got to understand where things are, and then selectively figure out where to break the system.
Yeah, and we're truly trying to make that entry point easier by doing things like these focal groups in the consortium, reaching out to APL and making sure that that's accessible to everyone.
Great. So there are a couple questions here in the chat about Europe or about international partners. So Niki, I wonder if you could just very quickly, because we're coming up on the top of the hour here, if you could just quickly talk to us about who you're working with internationally and what some of those partnerships look like.
Yeah, so just like I mentioned earlier, how our industry collaborations and those public-private partnerships are so important. Our international partnerships are just the same. I truly believe that without really having that triad of industry, NASA, and international partners working together, we won't be able to meet the sustainable objectives. So I've been very happy and excited about how early the discussion started with international partners from day one, just as I mentioned how the industry and the public-private partnerships are really baked into the whole concept of Artemis. So are the international partnerships. And for those familiar with Space Station, I would say the same thing. It is the International Space Station, and I think that's why that has been so successful as well. So we really have to learn from that and follow the same model. So we collaborate very closely with our international partners. We have agreements in place with a good number of them. You mentioned JAXA and the Toyota collaboration for the rovers. We're working with ESA quite extensively in a broad range of areas, including ISRU is one of those areas that we're very excited about working with them on. And working with folks like the Australians who have a new space agency, which I found very exciting to work with them. And they too have industry and their universities built in and baked into the start of their space agency, which is very exciting. So we're talking to them about things like, you know, obviously they do a lot of they have a lot of oil businesses, and they do a lot of excavation type work and teleoperations. So when we look at things like manufacturing and construction, using autonomous construction systems, talking to the Australians about and their industry partners on how they could we could partner with the teleoperations and even doing some high fidelity ground demonstrations using those capabilities. So we work with them regularly. We all have liaisons within our group, and we have regular meetings and discussions with them, and are actively from day one really identifying those core areas that just make sense for us to work together. And I think that's going to be one of the things that makes this come to fruition, truly.
Great, great. Well, look, Niki and Sean, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and very enlightening and a lot of fun. And I hope that the guests, our audience, were able to get some good stuff out of it. A couple of quick things to wrap us up here. I wanted to mention as far as accredited investors or such out there, we would love to hear from you. We are very excited to be on the verge of closing our first fund, hopefully in the next few weeks, and then looking around for an anchor for our second. So we're making progress, and especially as Sean knows, you have to stay alive long enough to thrive. First is stay alive, then thrive. And so hopefully we're going to start that curve up. But again, Niki, I really want to thank you. Send our greetings back to your folks there at HQ. And look, this is happening, and it's a very exciting period of time. We are heading back to the moon, and I did want to mention, by the way, that this evening, starting at 6 o'clock Central Time, I'm going to be hosting an hour or two, depends on how it goes, for the Moon Society's Lunar Development Conference. I'm going to have Sean and Meagan. Unfortunately, Niki, we invited Niki, but she can't make it. And but we would love you to drop on in there. We're going to expand on this conversation. And then a friend of mine, Dylan Taylor, and maybe one or two other surprise guests are just going to drop in, and we're going to talk about all kinds of things having to do with returning to the moon, because this time when we go, we stay. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Rick. Really appreciate it.